Hello, everyone. This is just a presentation on World War II. I'm going to as it says up there, a quick overview of World War II. What you're seeing right there is actually propaganda posters that were created during World War II. If you go on Google and Google World War II propaganda posters, you'll be able to see a ton of propaganda posters. These are just a couple of examples that you can possibly see there. What I'm going to show you is, to begin with, is 3 examples of American neutrality between World War I and World War II. And really, since Washington's farewell address, the United States is going to try to remain as neutral as possible, with probably the only exception of being the Spanish-American War that was in 1898. We're really going to adhere to American neutrality. And in doing so, we're trying to stay out of these global conflicts. One way that we try to stay out of this global conflict is we joined a pact called the Kellogg-Briand Pact that was 62 different nations that joined this pact. I mean, it was a paper tiger. They tried to outlaw war. That's why I always say with the Kellogg-Briand Pact is Tony the Tiger did not like war. But as you can take a look at this cartoon here, 35, 36, 37, 38, there's these explosions, and there's a huge explosion in 39. Why? Well, of course, the war starts in Europe in 1939, and it just blows up the peace that was going on during this time period. So the Kellogg-Briand Pact is pretty much known as a paper tiger. The other one that I'd like to talk about is the Stimson Doctrine. The Stimson Doctrine involves the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And the Japanese, the major reason that they are invading Manchuria is this country here has no natural resources, and so they're going to invade Manchuria. And invading Manchuria, the United States is going to say, we are not going to recognize any territory taken by force. Well, it ends up being a joke, because the Japanese really don't care if the United States recognizes that takeover or not. And so this Stimson Doctrine is just another example of us trying to stay out of a war. But if you notice the date, 1931, the Japanese actually start the progression of World War II before the Germans, because most of the time the Germans get blamed for it, but really it's the Japanese that started this international event in 1931. The next group that I will show you is the Neutrality Acts. This group, they were actually created by FDR. FDR is going to be the guy that's going to create these acts. And in creating these acts, he's just going to say, no, we're going to actually stay out of the war. But by doing so, he's going to limit himself. He's not going to be able to intervene when Great Britain is actually attacked in 1939 legally. But he will get around that by lending and leasing, as we will see later on, lending and leasing different armaments to the British, saying that, okay, you can actually use these for a 99-year period, and we don't expect them back. But as you can see with this Dr. Seuss cartoon, we're pretty much going to be an ostrich. We're going to stick our head in the sand, and we're going to watch Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo over in Japan come to power. Here's a timeline of events leading up to World War II, and these are just going to be a quick timeline that actually started World War II. The first of it being the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. I've already discussed that in the Stimson Doctrine, but you can see the picture down to the left of the child. We don't know what happened to the child, but this is one of the most famous pictures that was taken of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Then in January of 1933, you're going to have Adolf Hitler is actually going to be involved in the being appointed to the Chancellorship of Germany. Being Chancellor of Germany meant that he was put in charge of the army. Yes, that's the cute Adolf Hitler there as a baby that grows up to pretty much lead the Germans to utter destruction. The guy that actually I've always said is kind of the evil guy, evil genius behind this is this guy right here, Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler is going to be the leader of the Schutzstaffel, who is actually going to be the group that's going to create the idea for the Holocaust. And he's the evil genius behind Adolf Hitler. In 1935, you get Benito Mussolini. He is one of the other bad guys. That's going to be bad actors. That's going to be involved in this melee that's going to lead up to World War I. And Mussolini and Italy invades Ethiopia. The leader of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, actually goes to the League of Nations, asks the League of Nations for help, but the League of Nations, of course, is extremely weak during this time period because we, the United States, did not join the League of Nations, and in not joining the League of Nations, it makes it a very weak organization. Why did we not join the League of Nations? Well, we see it as another system of alliances, and the United States Senate did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which meant that we did not join the League of Nations. You then see in March of 1936, the Germans actually remilitarized the Rhineland. And in doing so, if you see this little map right here, the Rhineland actually is part of Germany. But in the Treaty of Versailles, they were told that they could not remilitarize this area because the Germans had always invaded through this area into France. And so they said, no, you cannot remilitarize this area. But in 36, Adolf Hitler is going to remilitarize this area in violation of the treaty. League of Nations pretty much yells at them and says, stop it, but nobody really is able to stop Adolf Hitler. And so in doing so, it gives Hitler the ability to go, hey, nobody's going to actually say anything, so everybody's so afraid of another world war. That leads us to, again in 36, the Axis powers is going to be created. The Axis powers originally are just Germany and Italy. As you can see here, the picture of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini taken. They joined together, but then they will be joined in 1940 by the country of Japan, and that country will then form the three countries that are kind of considered the bad guys of World War II, which they all are, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Those are the three countries that are actually the Axis powers that will be fought during World War II. In 1937, the Japanese continue their invasion of China, and it's probably one of the most grotesque invasion of the Chinese empire, which is the invasion of Nanjing, which is the southern capital, because their capital today in China is known as Beijing, which is northern capital, but they kill in Nanjing over 300,000, and it's also known as the rape of Nanjing because a lot of the Japanese men will go through a rape and pillage campaign of the Japanese women. And this is one of the reasons I've always said that you never want to ethnically get wrong a Japanese person or a Chinese person, because there is such hatred that is still left most Chinese and most Japanese that are from those two countries. Most American Japanese, most American Chinese don't have that tie, but back in the actual country still today, they have that hatred towards one another because of the consequences of World War II. Here in 1938, you're going to see Germany is going to say, hey, I'm going to put the band back together again. That's kind of their excuse. And what do they mean by that? They mean that they're going to put all the German-speaking countries back together again, and in doing so, they call it the Anschluss Plan. I'm sorry for those of you that speak German, and I'm probably not pronouncing it properly, but it's the closest that I have. It's called the Anschluss Plan. And that Anschluss Plan is going to bring Hitler's homeland, because Hitler was actually born in Austria, and it's going to bring Hitler's homeland back into the fold that all these German-speaking people are going to be put together. That's his excuse. He says, look, you can trust me. Of course we can trust Adolf Hitler that all he's going to do is put the German-speaking people back together. Well, he also extends that to include the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland, if you take a look at this picture up here, is this outer edge, the western edge of Czechoslovakia. 3 million German-speaking people were actually taken away from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles and put into Czechoslovakia for the past 20 years. Well, Germany, Adolf Hitler is actually going to request that he wants his German-speaking people back. And so Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, is actually going to request that Adolf Hitler be given that, but with the understanding that's all Hitler wants. Hitler's not going to take anything else. We can trust him. And as you can see with this paper right here that Chamberlain's holding up, he says, look, I got Herr Hitler's signature. He's not going to invade anything else. He's not going to take anything else. Look, we can trust him. I've shaken hands with the Fuhrer, and he can be trusted. Well, this guy is going to go down in history as the guy that appeased Adolf Hitler, that gave in to Adolf Hitler, because less than 6 months later, Adolf Hitler is actually going to invade and take the rest of Czechoslovakia. What's unique about him taking the rest of Czechoslovakia? Well, it's the first non-German speaking people that Adolf Hitler took. So he's lying. Oh my gosh, we cannot believe Adolf Hitler. Yes. And so in March of 1939, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia in total violation of the Munich Pact, making Neville Chamberlain kind of look foolish. In 1939, in August of 1939 of that same year, Germany and the Soviet Union are going to create what's called the Non-Aggression Pact. It's also called the Hitler-Stalin Pact. It's also called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact is going to be a deal made between Germany and the Soviet Union, purposely meant to keep the Soviet Union on the sideline. Germany's actually learning here. Hitler's not an idiot. He does not want to fight a two-front war, and in fighting a two-front war, that's what Germany did in World War II, and so they're actually he's trying to prevent this. And so what he will say is, I'm going to cede this land here to the Soviet Union. I'm going to give them half of Poland, and I'm going to give them free reign in the Baltic states. And in doing so, all Stalin had to promise was that he would stay out of the war. And he does. And he will stay out of the war until, of course, we can't trust Adolf Hitler. He will break the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1941. But this right here, this particular pact, allows Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany to start World War II, which we will see. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, leading to the beginning of World War II. And why do I say that? Because on September 3rd, Great Britain and France finally declare war on Germany. But if you notice, nowhere is the United States involved. And this is where I always say in my class, fish are friends. Why? Because we have the Pacific Ocean, we have the Atlantic Ocean, and that is going to allow us to stay out of World War II and really out of World War I for quite a while. We're almost out of the war for 2 whole years in World War II. We're going to watch the defeat of Europe and the bombing of Great Britain, and we're still not going to get involved in this war. We're literally dragged into World War II kicking and screaming. In June of 1940, Hitler's going to continue his march through Europe, and ultimately leading to the fall of France in June of 1940, where he will defeat France in pretty much 3 weeks. Hitler then will take a trip to France. He takes this famous picture of him with the Eiffel Tower, and then immediately returns back to Germany. But it's almost like a postcard to the rest of the world. Look what I have conquered. In September of 1940, finally the United States is going to ramp up getting ready for war. If there's a difference between World War I and World War II, the similarity would be we wait until the war is going until we actually get involved. But at least in World War II, FDR, to his credit, will begin prepping, begin getting people ready for World War II by having our first peacetime draft. And so we start drafting men into the military, and in doing so, we actually are going to reduce the unemployment rate, which that's the reason why. 1940, from that point forward, the unemployment rate is going to drop dramatically, because we are going to become the great arsenal of democracy that's actually going to help the Allies win the war, but yet we're still not involved in the war. In 1940, also, the United States creates the Lend-Lease program, and in doing so, we will begin lending and leasing different products. We're going to give them planes, tanks, guns, and ammunition, and supplies of all kinds, except soldiers. We are not going to involve soldiers in this particular campaign because we don't want to get involved. And these programs will will continue throughout the war, but they begin prior to our involvement in the war, because as you can see with this political cartoon, it's kind of making fun of Charles Lindbergh, because Charles Lindbergh sort of liked the Nazis. It says, "'Tis Hitler, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." Or "'Tis Roosevelt, excuse me, not Hitler, that the world should really fear." I mean, just kind of scary that one of our great aviation heroes is really going to be pro-Nazi in 1940, but then following that, he's going to, almost like Neville Chamberlain, look pretty bad when the Japanese end up attacking us and then the Germans end up declaring war on us. In 1941, Hitler's going to make the greatest mistake that he makes, luckily, and that's going to be invading the Soviet Union. And as I say up there, Hitler as Napoleon. Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and in doing so, he is going to move his troops all the way across. And as you can see, he comes almost within 20 miles of Moscow. But luckily for the Russians, and unluckily for the Germans, the Russian winter will set in. And what happens here is that as the Germans are moving across, the Soviets will hit and retreat and hit and retreat. And in doing so, they used what's known as a scorched earth policy. And that scorched earth means that they burn everything, so the Nazis will not be able to use any of their supplies. Well, by the time they get to this point, they're already out of their supplies and they're not ready for this Russian winter. And when it sets in, a lot of these people are going to end up dying of exposure, and they're just not ready to fight in the winter. And so for the next 3 years, they're going to be pushed back out of the Soviet Union towards Berlin until 1945. December 7th, 1945. This is a ding, ding, ding year. You have to know this year on the AP exam. When you're writing your essays, if you don't write December 7th, 1941, it's almost like we look at you going, have you ever attended an AP or been in an AP class? The Japanese on this particular day, they are going to attack the United States. As you can see here, you have a plane right there and a plane right there that is reminiscent of the attack that particular day. This is an actual photograph that was taken of Pearl Harbor on the day that it was attacked. What I'm going to try to do here is remove my erase. That's what I'm looking for. Remove my markings here. What you're seeing here is this particular photograph is a picture of the USS Arizona, and this USS Arizona is a ship that will be sunk in the harbor of Pearl Harbor. There's two ships that are unrecoverable because of the attack on Pearl Harbor. One is the USS Arizona, and the second one is the USS Oklahoma. If you were to continue and you see this next picture, you can see that the USS Arizona is still there, but it is underwater. And so if you take a boat over to the USS Arizona, you're able to see the ship underneath this water, and it is just amazing. I've been able to see this twice, and it is extremely impressive. This is actually part of the speech that FDR delivers. The one word that I always like to emphasize is infamy, because originally it wasn't infamy. He said December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history. Well, luckily, somebody had the idea and they scratched out world history and they put infamy, which means, of course, famous for being bad. And this speech goes on to pretty much say that we are going to continue to fight this war, and we're going to, in our righteous might, we will win through to absolute victory. And it's going to take us quite a while. It's going to take us quite a while to recover from Pearl Harbor, and then finally go out and start winning in the Pacific. April of 1942, I cover the Doolittle raid, the Jimmy Doolittle raid, because Jimmy Doolittle and a few other pilots were able to fly bombers over to Tokyo. And the main mission of this was to just prove to Tokyo that we could touch them. We're not going to be able to attack them greatly, but just that we could touch them. And so we actually strip these bombers almost of everything except for a couple of seats for the pilots and a couple of bombs that they could deliver on Tokyo. And so they make this long journey. They deploy the bombs. A lot of the planes ended up having to ditch into China and were rescued by Americans later on. But this Doolittle raid was just a forebearer of what was to come. We were almost telling the Japanese, hey, it's 1942. Yeah, you attacked us. We're going to bomb you, but we will be back. And it almost takes us another 2.5 years to get back there. But this is just a raid that is to tell the Japanese, we are going to come. You are not going to get away with this this tragedy that you did to us on December 7th, 1941. In 1942, I always like to cover this guy, General George Patton, old blood and guts. He's probably one of our most famous generals during this time period. Probably not a guy that you want to be your president, because we've actually had 9 generals that have been presidents of the United States. But this guy here is one of our best leaders and commanders. As you can see, he's probably most responsible for some of the victories that the United States had in Africa and also in Italy, and then he will help push the Germans back into Berlin. After the war, he dies shortly after the war, but before he's involved in an automobile accident, he is not going to make the president and Dwight Eisenhower happy when he makes the comment that, hey, we got our troops here and all that stuff. We're going to have to fight the Russians anyway. Let's just go ahead and fight them right now. And so they kind of are a little leery of General Patton, very much a aggressive warrior of the day. June the 6th, 1944 is D-Day. That is the day that we will actually invade Normandy, France, and in doing so, we're actually going to liberate the French. Pictured in front of you is actually Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower will also serve as president from 1952 until 1960. As I said, we've had 9 presidents that have actually been generals. And so Eisenhower is going to devise a plan to liberate the French. And in doing so, he's going to invade through Normandy. And this is him delivering his famous speech before the night before. This is actually delivered on June the 5th. But the night before, he's going to deliver this speech to the troops. And then the next day, if you've seen the movie Band of Brothers, or if you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, this is the invasion of Normandy during that time period. And the next slide that I'm going to show you actually has the pictures of the different people and different landing crafts that are actually going to be present during this campaign. This is a transport that's bringing our troops to the Normandy beaches. As you can see in the background there, you have the mountains that our troops are actually going to have to go up. This is a better picture of when all of a sudden the transport troops get there. We got to go through the water here, then across over to the beaches, and then as we storm the beaches, where our goal is to go up, the Germans are actually going to have stations up here where they're going to be shooting down at our troops, and it's just an extremely dangerous area. The Germans didn't expect us to come through this area. They expected us to go through Calais because it was a much easier way to come through, but we choose the harder way of going through just so we would be seen as unpredictable. This particular picture here shows what happens after the transports are actually delivered, and you can see all of the manpower and all of the equipment that's going to be delivered to help liberate the country of France from the Nazis. This one right here is a picture that kind of shows you the crosses that are still present in France today if you were to go to Normandy, France, and they're up on a hillside overlooking the cliffs of Normandy in respect to all of those men that died and that are buried there at Normandy. February 1945 is going to be the Yalta Conference. This is where you're going to have the meeting. It's actually the final meeting of the big three, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. They're going to meet in Yalta, which is actually in the Crimea. And for those of you that would like a little synthesis, the Crimea is actually located, or Yalta is actually located in Crimea. And that Crimea, if that doesn't sound familiar, it should. That's what the Russians over this the summer of 2014 invaded and took over. So this is the area that the big three will meet. They're meeting here at Yalta to actually discuss what's going to happen to Germany after World War II is over. And so they kind of discuss the war aims. It's at this conference that they start to discuss the idea for a United Nations, the creation of this organization that everybody's going to join and everybody's going to be a part of. And when they create the United Nations, as I will discuss later, they're going to, these three countries are going to help head it along with China and France. But to see Churchill, FDR, and Stalin is quite impressive here in February. But FDR is pretty much on his last legs. He is going to die in April of 1945. So this is going to be the last major conference that he's going to be involved in with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. In February also of that same year, you're going to have the attack, the U.S. invasion of the island of Iwo Jima. The unique thing about the island of Iwo Jima, this is the first island that the United States will take during World War II that the Japanese owned prior to World War II. So the Japanese are really going to defend this well. They've also tunneled their way in, and so we're going to lose close to 3,000 men in the first 3 or 4 days of this attack. But why is this so important? Well, we're going to get one of the most famous images that will come from this particular invasion, and it's taken on Mount Suribachi, which is the top of the volcano that actually formed this island. And as you can see here, Joe Rosenthal took all of these different images, but the one image that becomes iconic is the image of these 6 soldiers, and there actually is 6 soldiers that are raising this flag on Mount Suribachi. Now, 3 of the 6 soldiers that are pictured here are not going to make it off the island. And the one guy that I always like to point out is this gentleman that's located right here, which is Ira Hayes. Ira Hayes is a Pima Indian from the state of Arizona. Yep, I know, because I'm from Arizona, I have a little home field advantage there. But he's a Pima Indian. Ira Hayes is going to be his name. And Ira Hayes, Johnny Cash actually made a song about him, called The Ballad of Ira Hayes, because it is kind of a sad story. You have Ira Hayes is going to be this war hero. He actually survives, because like I said, 3 of the 6 do not make it off, but he's actually going to survive. And in surviving, he almost cannot handle the publicity, and he ends up drinking himself to death. So it is kind of a sad ending to a war hero, but Ira Hayes is one of the most famous Pima Indians of the war. Another American Indian contribution that I don't have in this slide presentation, but I'll discuss really quickly here, is the Navajo Code Talkers. They're probably one of the most responsible for the American victory in the war in the Pacific. And so what I always like to point out is the group that we are actually going to push off their land and pretty much take over their land is going to end up helping us and end up bringing about victory in World War II. So it is almost like, we say thank you to them for allowing, they were able to help us. And luckily, the Dawes Act didn't work as well, because the Dawes Act is meant to teach them to learn English and stuff like that. Well, they'll speak Navajo to each other, and not only will they speak Navajo to each other, they're going to speak a coded language to each other. And so the Japanese never broke that code, and that code lasted until the 1960s, until finally they released that, hey, we're actually using Navajos to talk to each other in order to pass along secrets. So yeah, Ira Hayes, it's a nice story to be able to talk about on your papers. As you can see here, they actually take that photograph and turn it into the Marine Corps Memorial that's located in Washington, D.C. It's actually in Virginia, just outside Arlington Cemetery. But as you can see from here, this monument is just massive when it comes to looking at it. And I've been there to Arlington a couple of times, and it's pretty awe-inspiring. As I told you before, in April of 1945, FDR will die. As it says there, he will have pretty much a massive stroke is what he's going to have, and so he dies into his almost like a month into his fourth term, and we're going to see Truman is going to replace him. I also show you one of the famous photographs of that particular day of how much Roosevelt meant to the American people. If you're a junior in high school, Roosevelt actually was president longer than you've actually been in school. It's just amazing. He was president for over 13 years, and so he meant so much to the American people. He's leading us through the Great Depression, and there's the arguments whether he got us out of the Great Depression, but he leads us to victory, helps to lead us to victory, and puts the right people in place in order to be victorious in World War II. And so that's why Washington and Lincoln is always, they're ranked number 1 or 2. Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, is always ranked typically number 3. There are some historians that actually rank him number 1, but I would have to probably tip the cap to him and say that he is probably the number 3 most outstanding president in U.S. history. May the 8th, 1945 is, you're going to see VE Day. VE Day means victory in Europe, and I have probably the most iconic picture of that particular surrender by the Germans, and it is of this sailor who is giving a huge kiss to this nurse who he does not know. And we actually didn't know who these people were in this photograph, but I always he just gives the full-on kiss, and if you take a look at that, his left arm, he has it wrapped around her head, and it's pretty much, he's not letting go anytime soon. And so he's just happy that World War II is over. You must understand that these men have been away from their girlfriends and their wives and their families for sometimes 4 or 5 years. Nothing like what's going on now. Normally, our soldiers go to Afghanistan or they'll go to Iraq and they'll have a deployment of 9 months or maybe a little over a year. Then they're back home for a little bit, but then they're sent back. Here, these men are over there until the duration, until the war is over. Very seldom did you ever get leave to actually go back to the United States. And so when this war is over, it shows in this particular photograph how happy they were. But we still have a war in the Pacific that is to be fought. And as you can see from this picture, you have Churchill, and that's Harry Truman in the middle, and you have Joseph Stalin. They're going to hold what's known as a Potsdam Conference. The Potsdam Conference is in Potsdam, Germany. And they're going to discuss, hey, what are we going to do with Japan? How are we going to defeat Japan? And Stalin's already thinking ahead. He's going, hey, I'm going to defeat Japan, and I'm going to actually try to get part of Japan. Later on, you'll learn about the Korean War, and in the Korean War, you had a divided Korea. There's North Korea and South Korea. Well, here, Joseph Stalin's thinking, well, maybe I can get North Japan, and the United States might have South Japan, or I might be able to get all of Japan. And so that's his goal here. But the unique thing about this, if you watch here, Churchill is actually going to be voted out of office by the British people, which is unbelievable to me. They actually put Attlee, which is that gentleman right there, as a new prime minister because they felt that Churchill was going to get them involved in another world war. And so the British people actually vote him out in July of 1945. They don't even give him celebration and stuff like that. Enough time to just glory in his the victory that he had, and so they vote him out, and they bring in Attlee. But the unique thing about this is that Harry Truman at this conference is going to get a note, and in this note, he's going to see the note to him says, "The baby has been successfully delivered." Well, what does that mean? in July of 1945, let me introduce you to the baby. The baby is going to be the atomic bomb. Truman at the Potsdam Conference learns that the baby has been successfully delivered, and that means that we actually exploded for the first time an atomic bomb, and it worked. And we saw the devastating effects of that. And so he warns Japan. He actually gives Japan an ultimatum. He pretty much surrender or face utter destruction. The Japanese, of course, don't believe us. Now, you got to understand, the reason that we're going to deliver this bomb onto the Japanese is because the Japanese, for the first time in world history, is going to use suicide as a way to change the tide of the war. And they do. With the kamikaze pilots, they start to change the tide of the war. And so the United States, August the 6th, 1945, they will send Paul Tibbets and the Enola Gay over to Hiroshima, and they will drop the first atomic bomb on Japan. And in doing so, about 80,000 people, 80,000 Japanese people are going to be killed immediately, with many other thousands going to die later on because of radiation poisoning along with birth defects. But our purpose here really is to save lives. We're saving Japanese lives, and we're also at the same time saving American lives. Most historians say that if the United States would have invaded Japan during this time period, the casualties, Japanese would have been in the millions, and the American casualties would have been close to 1 million. Truman then asks the Japanese if they would like to surrender, and the Japanese hesitate. So, as you can see from the devastation, you would think they would have surrendered, but they don't. So on August the 9th, 1945, they drop a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. And this happens to be Fat Man right here. Little Boy was the first one. Fat Man's the second one. I believe this one is the plutonium bomb. And actually, it doesn't hit the ground. It actually implodes, then explodes just before it's supposed to hit the ground. It's almost like a detonation. And in doing so, it's going to also kill probably 40 to 50,000 Japanese immediately, but it's going to save millions of lives, both Japanese and Americans, in the long run. That being said, we are the only nation on the planet that has used the atomic bomb, and I hope that we are the only nation that are going to use nuclear weapons in the future. These are devastating types of bombs, and we have bombs now that are 1,000 times stronger. They're the hydrogen bomb, and sometimes we have other bombs that we've created that are just immense, like the neutron bomb. These are different bombs that have been created with the purpose of trying to save lives. But if you can think about it, it does kind of sound funny that you're saving lives. What happens, though, is the civilian casualty rate goes up with the use of these type of weapons, because you're not just killing typically soldiers, you are also killing civilians. September 2nd, 1945 is known as VJ Day. This is where the Japanese officially surrender to Douglas MacArthur on the USS Missouri, as you can see pictured here. They will formally surrender on the 2nd. They actually started surrender on August the 15th, and then finally they will sign the papers and will surrender to us on September 2nd. Results of World War II. As you can see pictured here, this is a picture of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie the Riveter is, I've always said, women are they can thank Adolf Hitler for their job. I know that's kind of probably a controversial statement, but it's because of World War II that we actually get to see women in the workforce, women building different airplanes and boats and tanks and guns and all the other different things that we need, and we realize that they can do the job. This is just the iconic figure. We can do it for women working during World War II. Following World War II, a lot of women are going to end up becoming part of or be involved in the part of the baby boom generation. But I've always said the working in the 1940s is what's going to cause the 1960s, because you're going to have the teenagers that are going to be born from World War II that are going to protest, saying, hey, our moms should be given jobs, and we as women should be given jobs like they were given during World War II. And it helps to lead to what's known as the feminist movement of the 1960s. Also during World War II, you're going to see the civil rights movement. I've always said it kind of begins. You have Langston Hughes' poem here. I love it. Looky here, America, what you've done. Let things drift until the riots come. Yet you say we're fighting for democracy, then why don't democracy include me? I ask you this question because I want to know how long I got to fight both Hitler and Jim Crow. That's pretty good. We are going to fight World War II segregated. Black troops, white troops. Those of you that are in other minority groups, such as Asians or Hispanics, those groups, it's interesting. If you're in the Hispanic population, primarily Mexican Americans, you are going to serve both in the Pacific and also in Europe, and you're integrated into the military pretty well. Asians are somewhat integrated into the military. A lot of times, though, especially Japanese, we're not going to allow, it's really interesting, we're not going to allow Japanese soldiers to actually fight in the Pacific because we have a fear that they will actually join with the Japanese. We didn't have this fear with, I guess, Germans, Americans fighting against the Germans, that they were going to side with the Nazis, but we have this hysteria, and I go back to 1882. We have the Chinese Exclusion Act. We've always had somewhat of a hostile movement towards the Asian community. You also see the African American community create what's known as the Double V program. This is where we are going to have victory over Hitler and Jim Crow during this time period. You also see the rise during World War II of the Tuskegee Airmen, which is a segregated air force, which also showed the United States that, hey, maybe we should be able to give black Americans their civil rights, which, if you know anything about the 1940s and the 1950s and 60s, that leads us to the civil rights movement, because in 1947, Jackie Robinson integrates Major League Baseball. 1948, you're going to have the military is actually going to be desegregated by Harry Truman. And then finally you jump into the 1950s, and you're going to have 1954, the Brown case, as we will discuss later on, along with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, in the beginning of what's called the modern-day civil rights movement. But that can be traced back to the Tuskegee Airmen fighting World War II. The Japanese internment camps, probably one of the worst things, that civil rights things that we're going to do during World War II. We are going to move the Japanese off of the coast of the United States, as you can see along the West Coast, and we're going to move them into relocation camps. And we take their property from them. It's really a violation of their civil rights. As you can see from a few of these pictures, we didn't see the Japanese as good people. We didn't see them as, even though these are Americans, we didn't see them as trustworthy. This is also a picture of their dining hall. I think this one's actually at Hart Mountain in Wyoming, but it just shows you the mistreatment that we will have for the Japanese. Also during this time period, you will see a Japanese American that will actually sue. And his name is Korematsu, Fred Korematsu. And he will sue, saying that he should not be forcibly removed from his property because he did nothing to break the law, and he should not pose as a danger. Well, the Supreme Court will disagree. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court will actually rule against Korematsu, and so he will actually have to remain in the concentration camp. But this Korematsu case becomes extremely famous because it shows that at some time during war, if the president sees fit, he can actually violate your civil rights. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt did by issuing Executive Order 9066. One other thing that takes place during this time period is the rationing of goods. All Americans had to make sure that they were not spending or not using a lot of goods more than they should, because they were supposed to help the war effort. I love the picture down there to the left of the soldiers. Do with less so they'll have enough. And so it was a combined effort. People would create gardens, as you can see, the victory gardens, and people would not really waste. And as that one sailor says, when you take more than you can eat, you cheat your buddies in the fleet. In other words, don't waste things. And so you might have had grandparents that really are not wasteful. And why is that? Well, they went through the Great Depression and they went through World War II, where everybody had to ration their portions. Some significance of World War II, and we're almost finished here. Some of the significance of World War II. World War II is 4 times the death toll of World War I, and you can see the different casualties. I mean, you just take a look at the Soviet Union alone. Nearly 20 million people die in the Soviet Union. The United States, you have 405,000 soldiers that are going to be killed. 2,000 civilian deaths. Well, of course, we have the short civilian deaths because compared to the other nations, because the war was not fought in the United States. And I go back to fish our friends. The Holocaust is probably one of the most horrific things that will take place during this time period, where you're going to see 6 million Jews and 5 million Gentiles sent to the different death camps. This happens to be the tracks leading into Auschwitz that was located in Poland. They had the 6 major death camps that were located in Poland because that's where the majority of Jews were. Albrecht frei is what was put over the concentration camp, which meant work will set you free. It was kind of like the motto that you come in here and work is you're gonna be free if you're a Jew or if you're an undesirable, somebody that they didn't want in Germany. And so this just happens to be a picture of one of the gates leading into a concentration camp. Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust survivor that is pictured here from a picture of Buchenwald that would be taken. I think the Americans took this particular picture when we liberated this camp, but Elie Wiesel will write a famous book called Night, which just talks about his experience in the Holocaust. But the significance of the Holocaust, you have 6 million Jews and 5 million Gentiles die. And post-World War II, you're going to see, as I'll show you in just a moment, the Nuremberg trials, but you're also going to see the creation of an independent state that is going to be created because they needed a homeland for the Jews, and that's why the country of Israel in 1948 is going to be created. These are the Nuremberg trials. After World War II, we actually put the Germans on trial. Those Germans that are still alive. Hitler actually committed suicide, and so did Heinrich Himmler. Those two guys that we saw earlier, of course, everybody knows Hitler, but hardly anybody knows Heinrich Himmler. This is a picture of Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering was the leader of the Gestapo, which is kind of like the secret police, and also the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, during this time period. Rudolf Hess was Adolf Hitler's private secretary, and these two guys, along with these other guys with the headsets on, are actually being put on trial. You notice Hess is in a very he's in a position that's almost defiant position, where I'm not going to listen to this, and all I was doing, just like all the Germans were saying, all I was doing was following orders. Well, all of these men are going to be sentenced to death, but they were able to sneak in most of their mouths and most of their possessions. They had a cyanide capsule, and so Hermann Goering and Rudolf Hess and a few of these other guys are actually going to be able to commit suicide before we are able to hang them. But the Nuremberg trials are trials that actually put the Germans on trial. Interesting fact, we don't put the Japanese on these different trials as much. There are a few, but not as much as the Germans are. So really the Germans are punished more than the Japanese. But if you remember, 1931, the Japanese actually started this whole ball rolling. One organization that is going to be created after World War II is going to be the creation of the United Nations. In the United Nations, you're going to see the creation of the Security Council, or what's better known as the 15 country. There's 15 members of the Security Council, but 5 are known as the Big Five, or the 5 that actually have veto power. And those Big 5, as listed up there, are the United States, China, Russia, Britain, and France. These 5, if the United Nations wanted to, if there's a country that invades another country, for instance, what's currently going on in 2015, Russia possibly invading the Ukraine. Well, Russia's part of the United Nations, so if the United Nations came out and said, hey, we're going to send UN forces over to stop the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, Russia can just veto that, and that would mean that the United Nations cannot move forward. You can kind of see the problem because you have three nations that would kind of act together. That would be the United States, Britain, and France. And you have two nations that would act together, which would be Russia and China. All five nations were on the same side in World War II, but as soon as World War II is over, you're going to see China fall to communism in 1949, and the Soviet Union was communist, so there's a common bond there. I think I have pictures here of the actual General Assembly that meets, and I can't remember off the top of my head how many nations. I think it's 180, 181, 182, something like that, total nations that are members of the United Nations. And this is the current makeup of the UN Security Council, the 15 members along with the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. Here's my last slide that I have for you guys, just something to think about for World War II. You know, for us, the United States involvement will be 44 months. 350 U.S. soldiers will be killed every day in World War II. And the question is, do you think that the American people would have the ability to fight this war knowing this statistic? If we would have had CNN or Fox News or ABC around back in the day, would we have continued to fight World War II? I don't know. I look at it possibly, but and I hope that we would, knowing how evil the Nazis were, but we might have said, hey, come on, the Germans really aren't that bad. Come on, the Japanese really aren't that bad. Or maybe we would have turned our attention to the Japanese since they attacked us and ignored the Germans and allowed Adolf Hitler to remain in power. Luckily for us, the Soviet Union was involved in the European theater, and the Soviets are going to kill 3 out of every 4 Germans during World War II. So they're probably most responsible for the victory in Europe, but we will be the most responsible for the victory in the Pacific. World War II is typically seen as the last good war, because following World War II, you're going to have a lot of mini wars. You're going to have, it's the overall war is going to be called the Cold War, but then you're going to have the Korean War, and you're going to have the Vietnam War, and you're going to have the War on Terror, and all the wars that we are currently involved in. But I just go back to, if we would have had this casualty rate now, I'm not sure if we would continue the fight. I thank you for listening today. Hopefully you got a little bit of idea what World War II is about. This is, a pretty long time for you to listen, almost over 50 minutes, but I do appreciate it. Have a good day.